Hi everyone, welcome to part one of lecture two. In this lecture, we're going to go over the multidimensional framework, which chapter 2 of your primary text really talks about. And additionally, we're going to talk about the historical perspectives of individuals with intellectual disabilities and just take a quick little tour or ride throughout history to see how this population was viewed by society, how they were treated, and kind of where we are now. So part one again of this lecture, which will be this video, is going to focus on the multidimensional framework, and then part two will focus on the historical perspectives of individuals with intellectual disability. So, going here, I have some animation, so I'm going to go full screen here for us. All right. So what we're going to do here first is talk about our operational definition. So our operational definition provides boundaries or checklist items that must be present before we can further examine an individual with intellectual disability through our multidimensional framework. The multidimensional framework is also referred to as the constitutive definition of intellectual disability, and your book will talk a lot about that. So our operational definition, again, these are kind of our boundaries or checklist items that must be met before, again, we can really look at the person in a more multidimensional way. So again, remember these things, and we talked about these in lecture one, are deficits in intellectual functioning, adaptive behavior. And adaptive behavior has three domains, so conceptual, social, and practical skills. We'll talk a little bit more about what each of those things are just very shortly. And then remember, excuse me, the disability needs to originate before age 18, so during that developmental period. Here is the multidimensional framework and what it looks like. So your book will you'll see this come up over and over and over again. But when we're looking at this here, it's really important once an individual meets criteria or meets that operational definition, then to look at their diagnosis through this framework. And this really represents a huge progression in the field, especially with the changing from the term mental retardation, intellectual disability, to looking at this disability as more of a state-like behavior and understanding the supports that are necessary to maximize human functioning. So you can look here across the left. These are all of the areas which an individual with intellectual disability might have deficits in, some of which we know they have to have deficits in, again, in order to meet that operational definition, specifically intellectual abilities and adaptive behavior. But additionally, we also want to look at their overall health, which has to do with physical, mental, and overall well-being. Participation, the ability that they have to access things and participate in events in their community. And the context, which refers to where they're currently living. So again, the term intellectual disability assumes that there are these limitations in human functioning, and these are all of the areas of human functioning. Again, but this definition, this constitutive definition, it really recognizes that intellectual disability is really a dynamic reciprocal engagement between all of these different things and the difficulties they have and the supports that are necessary to mediate or make those things different, so we can ultimately ultimately maximize human functioning for these individuals. So again, it's this really important with this constitutive definition or multidimensional framework to understand that supports are necessary to make things better. And here, again, this is directly from your text, that supports are resources or strategies that aim to promote the development, education, interests, and personal well-being of the person that enhance human functioning. And these are all, again, all of the areas of human functioning that we're looking at with this. So this is going to come up over and over again, so make sure you have a really good understanding of this multidimensional framework and how it works. Right here. So what are all of these areas? So we're going to kind of go through each one. So first we have intellectual abilities. And these aren't just necessarily book smarts. When we're looking at intellectual abilities, rather, our intellectual abilities are our broad and deep capacity for comprehending our surroundings, general mental functioning, various mental functions across verbal and nonverbal abilities. And in the next lecture, we'll talk more about intellectual functioning and assessment. Chapter 4 of your book really talks about that. The second one here is adaptive behavior. And these are those conceptual, social, and practical skills that have been learned and are performed by people in their everyday lives. Those are the things, again, that really get us through life. So conceptual skills are understanding kind of functional academic skills, social, so understanding how to interact with others, making sure that you have appropriate judgment, aren't too naive or gullible, and don't get taken advantage of. And practical skills, those are things just like knowing how to tie your shoes, be fully toileted, understand how to navigate a building. Really three key points when we're understanding adaptive behavior, though, is that when we're looking at adaptive behavior, the assessment is based on the individual's typical performance during daily routines and not maximum performance. When we're looking at intellectual abilities and its assessment, and again, we'll talk about this in subsequent lectures, we're trying to get at maximum performance here. With adaptive behavior, we just want typical performance. So something like getting to work on time, so being able to follow a schedule, that's either you're able to do it or you're not able to do it, or you're not able to do it without a certain level of support. So really important to understand that assessment of adaptive behavior is based on an individual's typical performance and not maximum performance. Understanding that individuals will have strengths within their adaptive behavior limitations. This is something I think that is a pretty common misconception, and it'll kind of come up throughout the duration of the course, especially when we look at some new case law for individuals with intellectual disabilities, specifically the Atkins decision, that the general population, a lot of times when they think of somebody with an intellectual disability, they assume global deficits in adaptive behavior. And that's really important to remember that adaptive limitations certainly do coexist within strengths. All right. And then additionally, the last thing to remember with adaptive behavior is really take the person's context or their opportunities into account. So making sure that a person has opportunities to demonstrate their adaptive behaviors. So if they live in a community without public transportation, it's not really fair to say that they have a deficit in maybe navigating a subway schedule if they've never had the opportunity to show that skill. So making sure you understand the person's opportunities and contexts when you're looking at adaptive behavior. Our health refers to a state of complete mental and physical health. And health conditions, certain mental or physical ones, are really important because they certainly can impact human functioning. And depending on the etiology of the intellectual disability, there may be certain physical health conditions that occur more frequently. So it's important to make sure that that stuff is absolutely looked at, and making sure we also look at that and see what supports can be provided to help maximize their human functioning. When we're looking at participation, this is performance of people in actual activities and social life domains, the functioning that the person can have within society. These are best reflected through observations of engagement, involvement in everyday activities, so participation in events, activities, organizations, interactions with family members, parents, friends, peers, all of that stuff, recreation and leisure activities. So what deficits do they have in those areas? Again, what support can we put in place using their strengths, which is always really important when you're support planning, to help maximize their human functioning. Our last one again here, understanding human functioning, is context. And this describes the interrelated conditions within which people live their everyday lives. We'll talk a little bit more about context specifically, but this occurs looking at context. We have to look at it across multiple levels. So within the individual's home, within their neighborhood, community, on a state and national level, but really understanding the person within the context that they are currently involved in. All right, so now when we think about assessment and diagnosis, so how do we use this framework? The multidimensional framework and the operational definition in assessment for diagnostic purposes. So assessment is basically used to either diagnose, classify by disability characteristics, so the individual pieces that an individual may struggle with or have strengths in, and also plan for individualized support. So those are the three main functions of assessment, or reasons why we would do an assessment. It's important to understand what the function of the assessment is, so we can help pick what tools that we want to use, because they'll differ a little bit depending on the reason that you're assessing. So we'll use multiple methods depending on the function to systematically collect information and make decisions about whether or not we can diagnose someone, classify them in a certain category, and then plan for individualized supports. The purpose of the assessment dictates, again, like I mentioned, what type of data and or measures that will be used. Some reasons why we might want to do these things could involve legal protection under the law, making a person eligible for services, like here in Wyoming under the DD waiver, programming for services, and research. And research allows us to better understand the population, develop evidence-based practice, which I talked about in the second part of lecture 2. All of these things are really important. All right, so looking at our framework for assessment, we really want to, again, have a good understanding of the function or the reason why we're doing our assessment, so we know what tools and measures and methods that we might use. So again, the first function is diagnosis, and those purposes to say whether or not somebody, yes, does have the disability or doesn't. And then that is kind of the first step when we're determining eligibility for services, benefits, or legal protections. Things that you might use are IQ tests and adaptive behavior scales, which we're going to talk about again in the next couple of lectures. We need to have that documented age of onset because remember, this has to happen during the developmental period. Different developmental measures, getting good social history and educational information to help build a really good picture of the individual when we're making a diagnosis. So classify, this is going to help us kind of put people in more specific groups once they have their diagnosis. Again, it's really helpful for educational placement based on their level of need. And so really we want to see then once they meet eligibility for the diagnosis of intellectual disability, what's the intensity of supports they need across all of those 5 areas of human functioning that I just talked about. It helps us really understand how much special education they should receive, also reimbursement and funding for certain waiver services. The support needs intensity scale, which we'll talk more a little bit later in the semester, and your book will talk about it throughout, is something that's used. Understanding the levels of adaptive behavior, their IQ range, so are they falling really below that 70 cutoff or close to it? Understanding their environment, so what's kind of going on in their environment, looking at the etiology risk factor system, so what was the cause of the intellectual disability, mental health measures, or different benefit categories. And then the last purpose of assessment is planning and development of systems of supports. And these are really when we're looking, okay, we have the diagnosis, they've been classified into certain groups to understand the severity of the disability across all of those areas of human functioning. But now we need to plan supports and match supports. So when you're looking back to that slide that had that multidimensional framework and in that figure in your book, what are the supports that are needed to help mediate the difficulties? What are supports are needed to help bridge those gaps? And ultimately what we want to do is we want to improve the person's quality of life, taking their person's choices and their rights as a human into consideration. And then tools that may be used here, person-centered planning, where you take the individual's wants, needs, and desires into account. Understanding, again, their speech language abilities, motor, sensory assessments, functional behavioral assessments, behavior support planning, family support plan, because the individual, and we'll talk about this, it's really, when we're looking at an individual with intellectual disability, it's really important to take the family unit into account as well, because this population tends to live with their families a little bit longer than some, so it's really important to kind of have a good sense for what the family needs as a whole and how the person can function within a family. All right, I'm going to exit out here of this so you can see me again. All right, so when we're looking at the assessment criteria, we really want to look at we want to make sure that we're using good tools or good assessments when we're assessing an individual. So making sure that the assessment tools and process should absolutely match the purpose. So you want to look at then the function. So what are you doing? Are you looking to diagnose? classify, or plan for supports. Want to make sure that our findings are as valid as possible, right? We want good information and make sure that we have good tools. And this means that we want to make sure that whoever's doing the assessment is adhering to professional standards and ethics. They're following the guidelines of their profession. Making sure that language, culture, and physical limitations are taken into account. So when we're looking, for example, at somebody that may have motor difficulties or fine motor difficulties, if an assessment has a lot of manipulatives, maybe choosing one that doesn't have as many so you can get a really good, accurate measure of their performance and making sure that any physical limitation isn't getting into play. Additionally, language, if they speak more than one language, making sure it's in their language of origin. If they don't have verbal language, making sure there's options for nonverbal responding. Looking at multiple sources, so getting information from multiple people, individual and then family members, people they may work with or interface with. Making sure the norms are appropriate. So when we're looking at norms, this means that the scores, what we're going to get with a lot of these things are standardized scores, which means that the scores are compared to other individuals their same age. So we want to make sure that the norms are used are up to date. Usually assessments are renormed about every 10 years, and we'll talk more about this in lecture 3. But there's something called the Flynn effect, and there's a little video in there about that how it seems as though over time, IQ scores for a couple of possible reasons are increasing. So if you use out-to-date norms, your measure might not be as, or your score that you obtain from a measure might not be as valid. And then making sure you use knowledgeable informants. So making sure that you're finding people that really understand the individual and can give you good information. The results should be useful and purposefully applied. So they shouldn't do any harm to the individual. They should help, make the life better for a person. And then again, there's benefit. They need to be logical and legal. All the important people, the key stakeholders are involved in the person's life. So family members, work, the person themselves, and making sure that the assessment information is timely. So you want to make sure the assessment is done in a timely fashion, it's relevant, and it's clearly reported to the individual and to their family. Alrighty, so this concludes part 1 of lecture 2. Part 2, again, is going to kind of look at some historical perspectives. So thank you guys very much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions about the multidimensional framework, how it's used, and yeah, so thanks so much.